The rifle shot never came. Jane Langley's finger trembled against the cold curve of the trigger, her breath held tight in her chest, while 40 yards below the ridge, Ranger Homer Lawson walked straight into a trap he could not see and she could not warn him about with sound. She watched the mouths moving. 3 men, crouched behind the boulders at Devil's Pass, their lips forming words that the wind stole before they ever reached an ear. But Jane did not need the wind. She had not needed sound for 17 years. Her eyes fixed on the gang leader's mouth, reading each syllable the way other women read letters from home. Wait until he passes the second rock, then take him from behind. Her stomach dropped. Sheriff Wade Calloway, the man the whole town trusted, stood among Silas Kessler's men, his lips forming the betrayal as plainly as if he had shouted it across a canyon. Jane's hand found the mirror at her belt, the signal Homer had begged her to bring, and she angled it toward the sun, flashing the warning code they had practiced only 2 days before. Homer did not see it in time. He kept walking, his rifle slack in his hands, his trust in the sheriff still unbroken, unaware that the man he considered an ally had already sold his life for a share of army gold. Jane's heart pounded against her ribs. She could scream, and no one below would hear a woman's voice carry over that distance even if she could produce one loud enough, and screaming had never been her weapon anyway. Her weapon rested against her shoulder, its barrel steady despite the tremor in her hands, sighted on the space just behind Homer Lawson's spine where Calloway's pistol was already rising. She had one heartbeat to decide, one choice between the man she had sworn never to trust and the man she had somehow, impossibly, come to love. Her finger tightened. The shot cracked across Devil's Pass like the end of the world. To understand how Jane Langley came to be lying on that ridge with her father's rifle and another man's life balanced on her aim, one had to go back 3 weeks, to a dusty afternoon in the spring of 1878, when Homer Lawson rode into the town of Cottonwood Bend with a dead partner's memory riding heavier on his shoulders than his badge. Homer had been a Texas Ranger for 9 years, and in all that time he had never carried guilt the way he carried it now. 6 months earlier, his partner and closest friend, Ranger Elias Doyle, had been gunned down in an ambush that never should have happened. The information had been solid. The trap had been set by men who knew exactly where the Rangers would ride, exactly when, exactly how many. Someone inside their own ranks had sold that knowledge for gold, and Elias had died with 3 bullets in his back because Homer had trusted the wrong man's word. He never found out who the traitor was. The investigation had gone cold, buried under politics and the constant churn of frontier violence, and Homer had been transferred west, given a fresh assignment and told to forget it. He had not forgotten. He carried Elias' pocket watch in his vest, stopped forever at 4:17 in the afternoon, and he swore he would never again let a hidden motive slip past him unnoticed. Now he faced a new danger, one that felt disturbingly familiar. Silas Kessler, a former Confederate raider turned outlaw, had assembled a gang of nearly a dozen men in the hills outside Cottonwood Bend. Word had reached the Ranger headquarters in Austin that Kessler planned to strike the Army payroll shipment traveling through Devil's Pass, a haul of gold coin meant to pay soldiers stationed at Fort Concho. If the robbery succeeded, it would not only devastate the fort's operations, it would embolden every outlaw band between the Brazos and the Picos to believe the law could be broken with impunity. Homer's task was simple in theory and treacherous in execution: infiltrate the town, identify Kessler's associates, and stop the robbery before it began. But Kessler's men were cautious. They rarely spoke where they could be overheard, communicating instead through hand signals borrowed from years of trading and raiding among Comanche bands, signals that meant nothing to a ranger who had never learned that silent language. Homer needed a translator, someone who understood the shape of hidden words. He tried the local schoolteacher, a kind but useless woman who knew only the alphabet signs taught to a deaf student she'd once had, insufficient for reading fast, coded exchanges across a busy street. He tried the army interpreter at the fort, who understood some Comanche dialects but nothing of outlaw hand code. Every path led to disappointment, until the bartender at the Cottonwood saloon, a weathered man named Prout, leaned across the counter one evening and said something that changed everything. "You want somebody who can read what a man's saying without hearing a word of it. You want Jane Langley," Prout said, wiping a glass with a rag gone gray from years of use. "Out past Willow Creek. Deaf as a stone since she was a girl, but I swear that woman can read your lips clean across a room. Read mine once when I was cussing under my breath about a bad hand of cards. Called me out on it before I'd even set the cards down." Homer had frowned at that. A deaf woman. Deaf don't mean stupid, Ranger. Prout's eyes had narrowed. "She's sharper than half the men in this town and twice as ornery. Lost her pa 2 years back. Rustlers, they say, though nothing was ever proven. She runs that homestead alone now, breaks her own horses, shoots her own supper. Folks around here learned quick not to underestimate her." That warning should have prepared Homer for what he found when he rode out to Willow Creek the next morning. It did not. The homestead sat in a shallow valley ringed by cottonwood trees, a modest cabin with a sturdy corral and a garden turned neat and productive despite the harsh soil. Jane Langley was in the corral when Homer arrived, working a half-wild Mustang with nothing but a length of rope and the patient, unshakable calm of someone who had done this 100 times before. She did not hear his horse approach. She felt the vibration of hooves through the ground beneath her boots, and she turned before he had even called out a greeting, her eyes assessing him with a directness that made him feel, for one uncomfortable moment, entirely transparent. She was younger than he expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-browned skin and dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her dress was simple, worn for work rather than show, and her hands bore the calluses of a woman who labored for everything she owned. But it was her eyes that struck him hardest, sharp and searching, missing nothing, reading him the way other people might read a newspaper. "Miss Langley," he called out, then remembered, feeling foolish, and swung down from his horse instead, walking closer so she could see his face clearly. "Miss Langley, my name is Homer Lawson. I'm a Texas Ranger." She watched his lips as he spoke, her expression unreadable, and when he finished she signed something with quick, economical movements of her hands before catching herself and speaking instead, her voice a little rough from disuse but perfectly clear. "I know who you are," she said. Prout sent word ahead, said a ranger might come looking for a favor. She turned back to the Mustang, checking the rope at its neck. "I do not do favors for lawmen anymore, Mr. Lawson." "Not after the last one." Homer's curiosity sharpened. "What happened with the last one?" Jane's jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then she faced him again, her eyes hard. "My father was killed 2 years ago, shot off his horse not a mile from this very corral. I found tracks, I found a torn piece of cloth caught on the fence, I found everything a lawman should have needed to hunt down the men responsible. I brought it all to the sheriff in town, and do you know what he told me? He said a deaf woman's word could not be trusted as a proper witness, that I could not have possibly understood what I saw, that perhaps I imagined the whole thing out of grief." Her voice had grown tight with old anger. "He closed the case within a week, never looked twice at the evidence I gave him." Homer felt something cold settle in his stomach, a suspicion he did not yet have proof for but which nagged at him regardless. "Who was that sheriff, Miss Langley?" "Wade Calloway," she said. "Same man who still wears the badge in Cottonwood Bend today." Homer said nothing for a long moment, turning the name over, filing it away beside every other loose thread of this assignment. He had met Calloway only briefly since arriving in town, a friendly enough man with an easy smile, but Homer had learned the hard way that easy smiles meant nothing about a man's true heart. Elias had smiled easily too, right up until the day he trusted the wrong friend with the wrong secret. "I am sorry about your father," Homer said finally, and he meant it plainly, without the practiced sympathy lawmen so often used to smooth over uncomfortable moments. "I did not come here to ask a favor lightly, Miss Langley. I came because lives are at stake, and because I have exhausted every other option this town offers. There is a gang planning to rob an army gold shipment at Devil's Pass, and they speak to each other using hand signs I cannot read. If they succeed, men will die. Soldiers who have not been paid in months will go hungry. And whoever is helping them from inside this town will go free to do worse another day. Jane studied him, her gaze flicking briefly to the badge on his vest, then back to his face. You think Calloway is involved? I think it is worth finding out, Homer said carefully. And I think you are the only person in 100 miles who can help me find out the truth before it is too late. For a long moment, the only sound was the Mustang shifting its weight in the corral, and the distant call of a mourning dove somewhere among the cottonwoods. Jane's expression remained guarded, but something in her eyes had shifted, a flicker of the old grief mixed now with something sharper, something that looked almost like hope. Even if I wanted to help you, she said slowly, you should know what you are asking. I do not know sign language the way the Comanche use it for trading, not truly. I read lips, Ranger Lawson. That is my skill. Given clear sight of a man's mouth and enough light, I can tell you nearly every word he speaks, even from a fair distance if I have a spyglass. But hand signs are different. If your outlaws speak with their fingers instead of their mouths, I may be no use to you at all. Homer considered this, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a battered leather notebook, flipping it open to a page of rough sketches he had made from careful observation over the past several days. I have watched them 3 times now from a distance, using my own spyglass. They do use hand signs, but not constantly. When they believe no one is close enough to hear, they speak aloud, quietly, but aloud. It is only when they suspect they might be overheard that they switch to signs. If I can get you close enough, with a clear line of sight to their mouths during those unguarded moments, could you read what they say? Jane took the notebook from him, studying his sketches with genuine interest, her fingers tracing the crude drawings of hand positions he had attempted to capture. These signs, she said after a moment, some of these I do recognize, not from trading but from soldiers. My father served with the cavalry before he homesteaded here. He taught me some of what he learned, thinking it might help me communicate when words failed. She looked up at him. Something calculating had entered her expression, the look of a woman weighing a decision that mattered. You are asking me to put myself in danger, Ranger Lawson, to help catch men who may have already killed my father, working alongside a sheriff who dismissed my testimony because of what I lack. Why should I trust that this time will be any different? Homer met her eyes without flinching. Because this time, you are not asking anyone for permission to be believed. I am asking you for help because I have seen what you can do before I have any proof of it, based only on a bartender's word and my own desperation. If you help me and we succeed, no one will be able to dismiss what you saw and heard, because I will make certain the entire territory knows exactly whose eyes and minds stopped that robbery. He paused. And because I intend to find out the truth about your father's death regardless of whether you help me, Miss Langley. It seems to me the same men might be responsible for both. Something in Jane's face cracked open at that, a vulnerability she had clearly kept locked away for 2 long years. She looked away toward the cottonwoods, blinking hard, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter. No one has offered to look into that in a very long time. I am offering now. She turned back to him, and this time when she studied his face, it was not merely reading his lips. It was reading the man behind them, weighing his sincerity the way she might weigh the trustworthiness of a half-wild horse before deciding whether to climb onto its back. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy something in her, because she finally nodded once decisively. All right, Ranger Lawson, show me what you have seen. But understand this clearly. I do not do this because you asked prettily, and I do not do this to be rescued. I do this because I want the truth about my father, and because I refuse to let another good man die the way he did, choked out of justice by men too willing to dismiss whoever stands in their way. Her chin lifted. "I will read your outlaw's lips, but I will not be left behind waving a handkerchief while you do the dangerous work. Whatever comes of this, I intend to see it through myself." Homer felt something shift inside his own chest at those words, an unfamiliar warmth threading through the guilt he had carried for 6 months. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, a woman who might need protecting, might need convincing to step outside her comfort. Instead, he found himself facing someone entirely unlike anyone he had encountered before, fierce and clear-eyed and utterly unwilling to be underestimated. "Agreed," he said, and something in the word felt like the beginning of a promise neither of them yet understood. The following days blurred together in careful preparation. Homer rode out to Willow Creek each morning, and together they refined their plan, Jane teaching him the rudiments of the signs her father had shown her so he might at least recognize when the gang shifted from speech to silence. Homer describing every detail he had observed of Kessler's men and their patterns of movement through the hills. It was during these long sessions that Homer first witnessed the full measure of Jane's abilities, and the memory would stay with him long after that spring had passed into summer. They had set up a practice exercise on the third day, Homer standing nearly 60 yards from the corral fence where Jane waited with an old brass spyglass that had belonged to her father. Homer's task was to speak a message silently, mouthing the words without sound, while Jane attempted to read them through the lens. "Try something difficult," Jane called out, adjusting the spyglass. "Something you would not expect me to guess easily." Homer thought for a moment, then mouthed a full sentence, taking care to keep his face turned toward her the way she had instructed. He spoke of the weather in Austin the week he had left, a mundane detail chosen specifically because it held no obvious context to guess from. When he lowered his hands and waited, Jane called back the sentence nearly word for word, missing only a single article, her accuracy so precise that Homer felt a genuine chill move down his spine despite the warm spring sun. "Again," he said, unable to hide his astonishment, and this time he chose something absurd, a line of nonsense about a purple horse dancing in the rain, expecting the strangeness of the words to trip her up. Jane read it back perfectly, then lowered the spyglass with the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her mouth. "You are trying to catch me failing, Ranger Lawson. It will not work. I have been reading lips since I was 9 years old. There is very little a man's mouth can hide from me that his voice might otherwise conceal." Homer walked closer, shaking his head slowly, genuine admiration replacing his earlier skepticism entirely. "I have hunted outlaws across half of Texas," he said. "I have tracked men through blizzards and across dry riverbeds where any other tracker would have lost the trail within an hour. I thought I understood what it meant to have a rare gift for reading what other men try to hide. I did not understand at all, not until just now." Jane's cheeks colored slightly at the praise, though she covered it quickly with practicality. "It is not magic, Ranger Lawson. It is simply years of necessity. When the world takes away one sense, the others learn to work harder to compensate. I watched my father's mouth for years before I ever thought to test it on strangers. Watched the shape of every word, matched it against what little sound still reached me in those early months before the fever took the last of my hearing entirely. It became as natural to me as breathing." "Still," Homer said, and something in his voice had grown rougher, more sincere than he intended, "it is remarkable. You are remarkable." He caught himself immediately, embarrassed by how plainly the words had come out, and cleared his throat, looking away toward the corral where the mustang she had been training watched them both with wary curiosity. "That horse," he said, changing the subject deliberately. "You broke him yourself. I do not break horses, Ranger Lawson." Jane's tone carried a note of correction, sharp but not unkind. "Breaking implies destroying something in order to control it. I gentle them. There is a difference and it matters." She walked to the fence, and the mustang, which had shied from Homer's approach earlier, moved toward her without hesitation, nuzzling at her outstretched palm. "You earn a horse's trust the same way you earn a person's trust: patience. Consistency. Never breaking a promise once you have made it, even a small one. Homer watched her with the animal, watched the easy confidence in her movements, the complete lack of fear despite the horse's considerable size and obvious spirit, and felt something in his chest tight with an emotion he did not yet have a name for. He had known capable women before, women who ran ranches and raised families and survived hardships that would break lesser souls. But he had never met anyone quite like Jane Langley, whose competence seemed to radiate from every corner of her being, entirely unbothered by the limitation the world insisted on measuring her by. "Your father taught you well," he said quietly. "My father taught me that the world would try to tell me what I could not do," Jane replied, still stroking the Mustang's neck, "and that the only proper response was to prove, quietly and thoroughly, exactly how wrong the world could be." She glanced back at Homer, and something vulnerable flickered behind her steady gaze. "I have spent 2 years proving that alone, Ranger Lawson. It is strange, having someone finally believe it without requiring the proof first." That night, riding back toward Cottonwood Bend under a sky bruised purple with the last light of sunset, Homer found himself thinking of her far more than the mission ahead warranted. He thought of the steadiness in her hands as she worked the Mustang, the sharp intelligence in her eyes as she read his lips from 60 yards away, the quiet vulnerability she had allowed herself to show only once, briefly, before covering it again with practical competence. He had not expected to feel this way again after Elia's death, had not allowed himself to imagine trusting anyone deeply enough to risk the kind of pain that trust invited. But something about Jane Langley's fierce independence, so unlike anything he had encountered, made him want to know more, to earn more of her trust, to prove himself worthy of standing beside someone who needed no one's protection, and yet had chosen, however cautiously, to fight alongside him anyway. The days that followed brought their plan closer to completion, but they also brought Homer face to face with the growing suspicion surrounding Sheriff Wade Calloway. He watched the man carefully now, noting small details he had overlooked before. The way Calloway avoided direct questions about his patrol routes near Devil's Pass. The way he seemed to know details about the gold shipment's timing that had not yet been officially announced. The way certain men from town, men Homer now recognized from his surveillance of Kessler's gang, visited the sheriff's office under cover of darkness when they believed no one watched. He shared these observations with Jane during their sessions at Willow Creek, and her expression grew grimmer with each new detail. "It fits," she said one afternoon, sitting on the porch step of her cabin while Homer stood nearby, both of them watching storm clouds gather over the distant hills. "When my father died, Calloway was the first to arrive at the scene, even before I could ride into town to report it. He said a passing cowhand had alerted him, but no cowhand ever came forward, no one ever confirmed that story. I always thought it strange that he arrived so quickly to a homestead a full hour's ride from town." "You think he already knew," Homer said slowly, "because he was involved." "I think," Jane said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tightness around her eyes, "that I have waited 2 years to hear someone else say what I have suspected all along, and that hearing it now makes my hands shake worse than facing that Mustang the first day I tried to gentle him." She looked down at her hands, indeed trembling faintly, and Homer moved without thinking, sitting beside her on the step, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "We will prove it," he said. "Whatever role Calloway played in your father's death or in this robbery, we will bring it into the light. I promise you that." Jane looked at him then, searching his face with the same intensity she brought to reading a stranger's lips from across a room, and whatever she found there seemed to settle something within her, because her hands slowly stilled. "I believe you," she said quietly, and the words carried a weight that surprised them both. They sat together as the storm clouds rolled closer, neither speaking further, simply existing in each other's presence with a comfort that had grown, almost without either of them noticing, from cautious partnership into something considerably deeper. The storm broke that evening, forcing Homer to shelter at Willow Creek rather than risk the ride back to town through driving rain and treacherous mud. Jane offered him the small barn rather than her cabin, a practical arrangement that neither questioned, though both felt the charge of awareness that came from spending an unplanned night under the same roof, however separated by walls and propriety. It was during that storm, huddled separately but within shouting distance across the small yard, that Jane finally told Homer the full story of how she had lost her hearing, a story she admitted she had shared with almost no one since her father's death. She had been 9 years old when the scarlet fever swept through the small Texas community where her family had briefly settled before moving to Willow Creek. Her mother had died within days of falling ill, and Jane herself had hovered near death for nearly 2 weeks, her fever so severe the doctor had warned her father to prepare for the worst. When she finally recovered, the world had gone silent, the fever having damaged something deep within her ears that no doctor of that era could repair. Her father, grieving his wife and terrified for his daughter's future in a world with little patience for those who could not hear, had refused to let despair consume either of them. He had spent months learning to communicate with her, developing signs of his own devising alongside the careful, patient work of teaching her to read lips, insisting that she would not be diminished by what the fever had taken. He used to say that losing my hearing had only sharpened everything else, Jane said, her voice carrying clearly through the rain to where Homer stood in the barn doorway, watching her silhouette in the cabin window. My eyes learned to see what others missed. My hands learned skills that required no sound to master. He taught me to shoot a rifle before I turned 12, taught me to read the wind and the land the way he had learned during his years scouting for the cavalry. He always said the world had taken something from me, but it could never take everything, not so long as I refused to let it. He sounds like he was a remarkable man, Homer called back. He was, Jane agreed, and even across the rain-soaked distance, Homer could hear the grief still raw in her voice. Which is exactly why I cannot rest until I know the truth of how he died, and why. Whatever role Calloway played, whatever secrets that man is hiding, I intend to see them exposed before this is finished. Homer thought of Elias then, of the guilt that had followed him for 6 months like a shadow he could not outrun, and felt a kinship with Jane's determination that went beyond mere partnership in a dangerous mission. They were both, in their own ways, seeking justice for people the world had too easily dismissed, refusing to let old wounds close over unresolved grief. "We will get the truth," he said again, and this time the promise felt less like reassurance and more like a vow. The storm passed by morning, leaving the land washed clean and gleaming under a sky scrubbed of clouds. Homer rode back toward Cottonwood Bend with new resolve, and within 2 days, their careful surveillance yielded the confirmation they had been seeking. Jane, positioned with her spyglass on a ridge overlooking the alley behind the sheriff's office, one Homer had scouted as offering a clear view of the back door where suspicious visitors seemed to gather after dark, watched Wade, Calloway's mouth form words that confirmed every suspicion they had gathered. He was speaking with a man Homer had identified as one of Kessler's lieutenants, a scarred individual named Boone Tarver, who had been seen scouting the Devil's Pass Road on multiple occasions. Jane read every word through the gathering dusk, memorizing the exchange with the same careful precision she brought to every task she undertook. "The shipment comes through on the 15th, Calloway's lips had formed, according to Jane's careful reading relayed to Homer that same night at their now familiar meeting spot along Willow Creek. "I will make certain the regular patrol is reassigned that day, sent chasing a false report of rustling out toward the Concho crossing. That leaves the pass clear for you and Kessler's men to take the gold without interference. And the ranger?" Tarver had apparently asked, though Jane admitted this portion had been harder to read given the angle of the man's face. "He has been asking questions, watching too closely." Calloway's response had chilled Jane even in the retelling, his lips forming the words with casual, chilling ease. "Leave Lawson to me. I will lead him straight into your ambush myself, under the guise of assisting his mission. He trusts the badge too much to suspect the man wearing it. Homer's jaw had tightened at this revelation, old memories of Elias' betrayal rising sharp and bitter in his chest. "He means to use my own trust as the weapon that kills me," he said quietly, staring into the small fire they had built beside the creek. "Just as someone once used Elias' trust to kill him." Jane reached out then, her hand finding his where it rested on his knee, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both with its simplicity and its power. "You know the truth now," she said. "That is more than Elias had. Whatever Calloway plans, we can prepare for it, precisely because we already understand his hidden motive." Homer looked down at her hand covering his, then up into her steady eyes, and felt something settle within him, a certainty that had been building for days finally crystallizing into clarity. "Jane," he said, using her given name for perhaps the first time since they had met, "I do not know how to properly express what these past weeks have meant to me. You have given me more than help with this mission. You have given me reason to believe that trust does not always end in betrayal." Jane's breath caught slightly, and in the firelight Homer could see color rising in her cheeks, could see the careful way she considered her response before speaking it. "I have spent 2 years believing that no one would ever look at me and see anything beyond what I lack," she said quietly. "You have never once treated my deafness as a limitation to overcome, Homer Lawson. You have treated it as simply another fact about who I am, alongside my skill with a rifle or my ability to gentle a wild horse. That is a rare gift you have given me, whether you intended it as such or not." Their faces had drawn closer during this exchange, drawn by a gravity neither fully understood nor resisted, and when their lips finally met beside that small fire along Willow Creek, it felt to both of them less like a beginning and more like an inevitable conclusion to everything that had passed between them over the preceding weeks. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them aware of the danger surrounding their growing feelings, the mission still ahead of them, the uncertain future that awaited beyond whatever happened at Devil's Pass. But gentleness gave way gradually to something deeper, something that spoke of two wounded souls finding unexpected solace in each other's presence, two fiercely independent people discovering that partnership need not mean surrendering one's strength. When they finally parted, Jane rested her forehead against Homer's, her breath still uneven, her eyes searching his face in the flickering firelight. "This complicates things considerably," she said, and Homer laughed softly, the sound rough with emotion. "It does," he agreed, "but I find I do not particularly mind the complication." They spent the remainder of that evening finalizing their plans for the 15th, though the conversation carried a new warmth beneath its careful strategy, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever happened at Devil's Pass, they now faced it not merely as reluctant partners, but as two people who had come to care for each other far beyond the boundaries of their original arrangement. The days leading up to the 15th passed in careful preparation. Homer sent a coded message to Ranger headquarters in Austin, requesting reinforcements while deliberately withholding the full details of Calloway's betrayal from any local channel that might reach the sheriff's ears. Jane continued her surveillance, gathering additional confirmation of the gang's plans, memorizing troop movements and timing details that would prove crucial once the ambush began. They also prepared their own signals, refining the system Jane had first demonstrated with her father's brass spyglass into something more sophisticated. Homer acquired a small mirror specifically for flashing coded signals across distance, teaching Jane the basic patterns they would use to communicate silently once the operation began. Jane, in turn, taught Homer enough of the sign language her father had shown her that he could recognize, if not fully translate, the gang's silent communications should Jane's position somehow become compromised during the operation itself. Through it all, their relationship deepened with each passing day, stolen moments between planning sessions where they simply existed together. Homer learning to sign simple phrases, so he might communicate with Jane even when his voice could not carry clearly. Jane teaching him patience with the Mustang she called Storm, allowing him to participate in the gentle work of earning the animal's trust. "You are better with him than I expected," Jane admitted one afternoon, watching Homer approach the horse with slow, deliberate movements, exactly as she had instructed. "Most men your size try to overpower a horse's spirit rather than earn its cooperation." "I had a good teacher," Homer replied, glancing back at her with a smile that had grown increasingly natural over their weeks together. "Though I confess, watching you work has taught me considerably more than mere horsemanship." Jane's cheeks colored, though her expression remained composed. "Do not grow too comfortable with flattery, Ranger Lawson. We still have dangerous work ahead of us." "I know," Homer said, his expression growing serious. "Which is precisely why I need to ask you something important, Jane, before the 15th arrives." She turned to face him fully then, sensing the shift in his tone, waiting. "I want you to stay away from Devil's Pass that day," he said carefully, watching her expression darken even before he finished speaking. "Let me take the information you have gathered, let me coordinate with the reinforcements from Austin, and let me handle the confrontation itself. You have already given me everything I need to stop this robbery and expose Calloway's betrayal. There is no need for you to place yourself in further danger." Jane's eyes had gone hard. The fierce independence he had come to admire now turned into something closer to anger. "You would ask me to sit safely at home," she said, her voice tight with restrained fury, "while you ride into an ambush that specifically targets you, based on information that only I can verify in the moment it matters most. Homer, Calloway plans to lead you into that ambush himself. He will speak words meant to reassure you, meant to keep you unsuspecting until the moment his men strike. Without someone reading his lips in real time, watching for the signal that betrays his true intent, you will have no warning at all beyond whatever plan we have already established. Plans change, Homer. Men adjust their timing. I have watched enough of these outlaws to know that Kessler is not a man who follows a script rigidly." "That is precisely why I do not want you there," Homer said, his own voice rising slightly with the tension of the argument. "If something changes, if the ambush occurs earlier than planned or in a location we have not anticipated, you could be caught in crossfire with no way to hear a warning shout, no way to react to danger approaching from a direction you cannot see. And you think I have survived alone on this homestead for 2 years, gentling wild horses and hunting my own supper and defending myself against rustlers, without learning to watch every direction at once." Jane's chin had lifted in that familiar gesture of stubborn pride. "I do not need my ears to know when danger approaches, Homer Lawson. I have spent my entire life developing senses that compensate for what I lack. You are not protecting me by leaving me behind. You are simply repeating the same mistake Sheriff Calloway made 2 years ago, deciding that my deafness makes me less capable of judging danger than a man with full hearing." The comparison struck Homer like a physical blow, and he flinched visibly, understanding immediately the weight of what she had just accused him of. He had not meant it that way, had genuinely believed his concern came from care rather than condescension, but he could see now how thin that distinction truly was from where Jane stood. "You are right," he said slowly, the admission costing him something but feeling entirely necessary. "I apologize. I was not thinking of your capability. I was thinking only of my own fear of losing you, and I expressed that fear poorly, in a way that dismissed everything you have proven to me these past weeks." Jane's expression softened slightly at his honesty, though her resolve remained firm. "I understand fear, Homer. I feel it too, every time I imagine you walking into that pass with Calloway's false reassurances in your ear. But I would rather face that fear standing beside you, using every skill I possess to protect us both, than sit safely at home wondering whether the man I love survived a trap I might have helped him avoid." The word love hung in the air between them, spoken almost accidentally in the heat of their disagreement, and both of them seemed to realize its weight simultaneously. Homer stepped closer, his expression shifting from frustration into something far more vulnerable. "You love me," he said softly, not quite a question. Jane held his gaze steadily, though he could see her pulse fluttering at her throat. "I do," she said simply, "which is precisely why I refuse to be left behind while you walk into danger I could help you survive." Homer closed the remaining distance between them, cupping her face gently in his rough hands. "I love you too, Jane Langley," he said, "more than I know how to properly express. And because I love you, I understand now that trying to protect you by excluding you from this fight would be a betrayal of everything that makes you who you are." He took a breath, steadying himself. "You will come to Devil's Pass. We will face Calloway's betrayal together exactly as we have prepared. I trust you completely, Jane. I trust your eyes, your judgment, and your courage as much as I trust my own rifle." Jane's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears at his words, and she leaned into his touch, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me clearly exactly as I am." Their kiss that afternoon carried a different weight than the first one beside the fire, a deeper certainty born of honest conflict, resolved through mutual respect, rather than one partner yielding to the other's fear. When they finally parted, both of them understood that whatever happened at Devil's Pass, they would face it as true partners, equal in courage and equal in the love that had grown between them despite every danger surrounding its beginning. The 15th arrived with a clear sky and a cold wind sweeping down from the north, the kind of morning that seemed to promise nothing beyond ordinary frontier business, giving no hint of the violence that would unfold before sunset. Homer met with Sheriff Calloway that morning as planned, allowing the man to believe his deception remained undetected, listening carefully as Calloway outlined the patrol schedule that would supposedly keep Devil's Pass secure during the gold shipment's passage. Homer thanked him for his assistance, shook his hand with the same steady grip he had always offered, and rode out toward the pass with every appearance of a ranger unaware he walked toward a trap. Jane, meanwhile, made her way to the ridge overlooking Devil's Pass by a different route, one she had scouted carefully over the preceding days, carrying her father's rifle and the brass spyglass that had served her so well throughout their preparation. She settled into position well before the gold shipment's scheduled arrival, watching the pass below with patient, careful attention, waiting for the moment when Kessler's men would reveal themselves. The reinforcements Homer had requested from Austin arrived quietly, positioned discreetly among the rocks and scrub brush flanking the pass, ready to move the moment the ambush revealed itself. Homer had insisted on this careful staging specifically because he wanted Calloway to believe his betrayal remained undiscovered until the final possible moment, when exposure would leave the traitor no opportunity to escape or warn his associates. The gold shipment, a modest wagon guarded by 4 soldiers, entered Devil's Pass precisely on schedule, and for a tense quarter-hour, nothing happened beyond the ordinary creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of horses' hooves against the rocky ground. Then Jane, watching through her spyglass, saw movement among the boulders on the pass's western side, 3 men she recognized from her earlier surveillance emerging cautiously from cover. Her breath caught as she recognized among them Boone Tarver, and beside him, unmistakably, Sheriff Wade Calloway himself, no longer playing the role of trusted lawman but standing openly among Kessler's gang. She watched Calloway's mouth move, reading his words with the same careful precision she had applied throughout their preparation. "Wait until he passes the second rock, then take him from behind." Her blood ran cold. Calloway was not speaking of the gold shipment at all. He was speaking of Homer, who had positioned himself near the pass's entrance specifically to observe the ambushes beginning before signaling the reinforcements to move. This was the moment Homer had feared, the plan changing in ways their preparation had not anticipated. Calloway meant to eliminate Homer personally, before the wider ambush on the shipment even began, removing the one man capable of exposing his betrayal before that exposure could occur. Jane's hand found the signal mirror at her belt instantly, angling it toward the sun in the pattern they had practiced, flashing the warning as urgently as she could manage. But Homer, positioned with his attention fixed on the gold shipment and the boulders where he expected the ambush to originate, did not immediately notice her signal. This was the moment the story had opened upon, Jane's finger tightening against her rifle's trigger as Calloway's pistol rose behind Homer's unsuspecting back, the entire careful plan threatening to collapse into tragedy in the space of a single heartbeat. Jane did not hesitate further. She had spent 2 years training for exactly this kind of impossible shot, hours upon hours practicing, until her aim had become as reliable as her ability to read a stranger's silent words. She adjusted her sight fractionally, accounting for the distance and the slight crosswind she had noted earlier that morning, and fired. The bullet found Calloway's shoulder rather than his heart, a deliberate choice Jane had made in that final instant, wounding rather than killing the man who might yet provide crucial testimony about her father's death. Calloway's pistol discharged harmlessly into the dirt as he crumpled, his cry of pain finally alerting Homer to the danger that had loomed behind him. Homer spun immediately, rifle raised, taking in the scene with the swift comprehension of a man who had spent years reading danger in every direction. He saw Calloway writhing on the ground, saw Boone Tarver and the remaining outlaw scrambling for cover, and understood instantly what had happened, who had saved his life in the space of a single, impossibly precise shot. The reinforcements moved then, emerging from their concealed positions with weapons drawn, and the brief exchange of gunfire that followed proved decisive. Kessler's men, caught between the exposed betrayal and the sudden appearance of armed rangers where they had expected none, surrendered within minutes rather than face a battle they could not win. Silas Kessler himself, positioned further up the pass, awaiting his lieutenant's signal to strike the gold shipment, found himself surrounded before he even understood the ambush had failed. Homer secured Calloway personally, binding the wounded sheriff's injured shoulder with practical efficiency, even as he read him his rights as a ranger, informing him plainly that his betrayal, his role in the planned robbery, and his complicity in whatever had truly happened to Jane Langley's father 2 years earlier would all be thoroughly investigated. Calloway, pale with pain and the sudden collapse of his careful scheme, offered little resistance to arrest, though his eyes carried a bitter resignation as Homer's men led him away toward the wagon that would transport him back to Cottonwood Bend for formal charges. Only once the immediate danger had passed did Homer turn his full attention toward the ridge where Jane's shot had originated, and he found her already making her way down the slope, her father's rifle still clutched in steady hands, her expression a complicated mixture of relief and lingering fear at how close disaster had come to claiming him. He met her halfway, closing the final distance between them with long, urgent strides, and when they finally reached each other, he pulled her into an embrace so fierce it nearly lifted her off her feet. "You saved my life," he said against her hair, his voice rough with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Jane, that shot from that distance in that wind, hitting exactly where you intended without killing a man you needed alive for testimony. I have known expert marksmen in my years as a ranger, and I have never witnessed anything approaching that kind of precision." Jane pulled back slightly, searching his face, still trembling faintly from the adrenaline of the moment. "I could not lose you," she said simply. "Not after everything. Not when I finally understood what it meant to have someone see me completely." Homer's expression, already full of relief and gratitude, shifted into something deeper as he studied her, a dawning realization spreading across his features that went beyond mere admiration into something closer to reverent astonishment. He had told her before that she was remarkable, had meant it sincerely in the moment, but standing here now, understanding fully what she had just accomplished, The sheer scope of her capabilities struck him with fresh force. "I do not think I fully understood," he said slowly, "exactly how extraordinary you are, Jane Langley, until this very moment. I have spent 9 years among the finest marksmen the Rangers employ, and not one of them could have made that shot under these conditions. You did not simply save my life. You did it with a precision and control that most men spend their entire careers trying to achieve." He shook his head, something like wonder replacing the last of his fear. "I am in awe of you." Jane's cheeks flushed at the intensity of his praise, though she held his gaze steadily, refusing to deflect the acknowledgement as she might once have done out of old habit. "My father taught me well," she said, echoing words she had spoken before, though this time they carried a different weight, an acceptance rather than mere explanation. "And I have had 2 years alone to perfect what he began teaching me. I am glad, more than I can properly express, that those years of practice served some purpose beyond mere survival." "They saved my life," Homer said again, cupping her face gently. "And they exposed the truth about Calloway, which means we may finally learn the full truth about your father's death as well." That truth emerged over the following weeks as Calloway, facing serious charges for his role in the attempted robbery and his corruption as a lawman, agreed to a full confession in exchange for consideration in his sentencing. He admitted that 2 years earlier, he had indeed been involved with an earlier iteration of outlaw activity in the region, though not yet formally allied with Kessler's specific gang. Jane's father had discovered evidence of Calloway's corruption, cattle rustling operations he had been quietly protecting in exchange for a share of the profits, and had confronted the sheriff directly, threatening to expose him to territorial authorities. Calloway, panicked at the threat to his position and his illicit income, had arranged for associates to silence Jane's father permanently, staging the killing to appear as an unrelated act of rustler violence. When Jane had brought her evidence forward afterward, Calloway had dismissed her testimony specifically because he feared what a more thorough investigation might reveal about his own involvement, using her deafness as a convenient excuse to bury a case that threatened to expose him. The confession, delivered before territorial officials with Homer present as the arresting ranger, finally granted Jane the justice she had sought for 2 long years, a formal acknowledgement that her father had been murdered specifically because he had tried to do right, and that her own testimony, dismissed so callously at the time, had in fact been entirely accurate and worthy of the investigation it never received. Jane wept when the confession was read into official record, tears that mixed grief for her father with something like relief at finally having the truth acknowledged by the very system that had once dismissed her. Homer stood beside her throughout the proceedings, his hand steady in hers, offering silent support that required no words to convey its depth. "He knew," Jane said afterward, as they walked together away from the territorial courthouse in the nearby county seat, the autumn air carrying the first hints of the coming winter's chill. "My father knew something was wrong with Calloway, and it cost him his life, but at least now the world knows he was right. At least now no one can say I imagined it, or misunderstood, or invented a story out of grief. No one will ever say that again," Homer said firmly. "Not after what you accomplished at Devil's Pass. Not after everyone in this territory learns exactly how a deaf homesteader's extraordinary skill exposed a corrupt sheriff and saved a ranger's life and an army payroll shipment in a single decisive action." He paused, then added more quietly, "Not after everyone learns that I intend to marry the finest markswoman and the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and that I would trust her judgment above any other person alive." Jane stopped walking, turning to face him with wide, startled eyes. "Homer Lawson, are you asking me to marry you in the middle of a dusty street outside a courthouse?" Homer's expression grew suddenly sheepish, though he did not retreat from the sentiment, only from its clumsy delivery. He took her hands in both of his, steadying himself with visible effort, and tried again, his voice carrying the same sincerity that had characterized every moment of their growing partnership. "Jane Langley," he said, "I came to this territory carrying guilt I did not know how to release, certain that trust only ever led to betrayal and loss. You have shown me something entirely different. You have shown me that trust, properly placed in the right person, can lead to partnership, to courage, and to love more profound than I ever believed myself capable of experiencing again. I do not want to spend another day of my life without you beside me, whether facing outlaws in a mountain pass or simply gentling horses in your corral at Willow Creek. Will you marry me?" Jane's eyes had filled with fresh tears, though these carried none of the grief of moments before, only overwhelming joy. She nodded, unable to trust her voice for several long seconds before finally managing to speak. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Homer Lawson, I will marry you." Their wedding took place 6 weeks later at Willow Creek, a simple ceremony attended by the small community of Cottonwood Bend, many of whom had come to view Jane with newfound respect following the events at Devil's Pass. Prout the bartender attended, along with the new sheriff appointed to replace Calloway, a decent man named Sheriff Foster who had made a point of personally apologizing to Jane for his predecessor's injustice and promising a very different standard of respect going forward. Homer had requested and received a permanent posting near Cottonwood Bend rather than returning to the more itinerant patrol work that had defined his previous years as a ranger. He told Jane during the quiet evenings they spent together in the weeks before their wedding, to build a life rooted in one place, beside the homestead that had already come to feel like home in every sense that mattered. They were married beneath the cottonwood trees that gave the homestead its name, Jane in a simple dress she had sewn herself, Homer in his best clothes with his ranger badge polished to a bright shine, both of them speaking vows that acknowledged plainly the unconventional path that had brought them together. "I promise," Homer said, his voice carrying clearly across the small gathering, "to never mistake your strength for something requiring my protection rather than my partnership. I promise to see you fully, exactly as you are, every single day for the rest of our lives together." Jane, in turn, signed her own vows alongside speaking them aloud, a gesture Homer had specifically requested so that everyone present might understand the depth of communication they had built together, despite the barrier that had once seemed insurmountable to lesser men. "I promise," she said, her hands moving in the graceful signs her father had taught her so many years before, "to never let the world's assumptions about my limitations define what I am capable of, and to trust that you, Homer Lawson, will always see beyond those assumptions to the truth of who I am. I promise to stand beside you, not behind you, in every challenge our life together brings." Their first kiss as husband and wife drew genuine applause from the gathered witnesses, and the celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, filled with music and dancing, and the kind of warmth that comes from a community witnessing genuine happiness born from genuine hardship overcome. Their life together settled into a rhythm neither had quite expected, but both came to cherish deeply. Homer maintained his ranger duties in the surrounding territory, though he made certain his patrols never kept him away from Willow Creek for longer than necessary, and Jane continued her work gentling horses, her reputation growing throughout the region as word spread of her remarkable skill, drawing customers from towns considerably farther afield than Cottonwood Bend had ever attracted before her marriage. She also began, at Homer's gentle encouragement, teaching basic sign language to children in the local school, sharing the skills her father had given her with a new generation, ensuring that others who might face similar challenges would grow up with more resources than she had once possessed. The schoolteacher who had proven so useless to Homer's original search now became one of Jane's closest allies in this effort, the two women working together to establish a small but growing program that other frontier communities soon sought to emulate. 2 years into their marriage, Jane gave birth to their first child, a son they named Elias, after the partner whose death had haunted Homer for so long before Jane's love had helped him finally release that guilt into something more like peaceful remembrance rather than crushing weight. Elias Lawson arrived on a crisp autumn morning, healthy and strong, and Homer wept openly holding his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the completeness of the joy that had once seemed impossible to imagine during those dark months following his friend's betrayal and death. 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, in honor of the grace Jane had shown Homer throughout their courtship, the patience she had extended even when his protective instincts had threatened to undermine the partnership she demanded and deserved. Grace grew up watching her mother work with horses in the corral and her father patrol the surrounding hills with the quiet authority of a respected ranger, absorbing from both parents the same fierce independence and deep capability that had first drawn them together. Jane never lost her hearing back, of course. No doctor of that era possessed such capability, but she never again encountered anyone who treated that fact as a limitation worth dismissing. Her reputation throughout the territory had grown into something approaching legend, the deaf homesteader who had read a trader's lips and saved a ranger's mission, whose marksmanship had proven more precise than any man's in the region, whose partnership in marriage exemplified something increasingly rare in frontier life. Two equally strong individuals choosing to build something greater together than either could have built alone. Homer, for his part, found in Jane not merely a wife but a true partner in every sense the word implied, someone whose counsel he sought before major decisions, whose judgment he trusted implicitly, whose strength complemented his own rather than requiring his protection to survive. The guilt he had carried following Elia's death slowly transformed, over their years together, into a quieter form of remembrance, the pocket watch still carried in his vest now serving as a reminder not of failure, but of the lesson that trust, properly placed, could heal wounds that seemed permanent. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, they sat together on the porch of the home Homer had helped expand at Willow Creek, watching their 2 children play in the fading light of a Texas summer evening. And Homer found himself thinking back to that first afternoon, when he had ridden into this valley, expecting merely a translator for outlaw hand signs, never imagining he would find instead the woman who would fundamentally reshape his understanding of strength, trust, and love. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have gone?" he asked Jane, who sat beside him with her hand resting comfortably in his. "If Prude had never mentioned your name, if I had simply given up on finding someone who could help me understand what Kessler's men were planning." Jane considered this, watching Elias chase his younger sister across the yard with the boundless energy of childhood. "I think," she said finally, "that some things are simply meant to happen, regardless of how many paths might have led elsewhere. You needed a translator, and I happen to possess exactly the skill required, forged from circumstances neither of us would have chosen but which ultimately brought us together." She turned to look at him fully, her expression carrying the same steady confidence that had first captured his attention years before. "I do not believe in wasting time imagining alternate paths, Homer Lawson. I believe in appreciating the path we actually walked, difficult as parts of it proved to be." Homer smiled, leaning over to press a gentle kiss against her temple. "A wise philosophy, Mrs. Lawson." "I learned it from a wise man," Jane replied, "who taught me that the world's assumptions about limitation are far less important than the truth of what a person actually proves themselves capable of achieving." They sat together as the sun set fully behind the distant hills, their children's laughter carrying across the yard, the homestead that had once held only grief and solitary survival now filled with the warmth of a family built from courage, from hard-won trust, and from a love that had proven, in the crucible of danger and betrayal, stronger than any obstacle either of them had faced alone. The gold shipment that Calloway and Kessler had schemed to steal reached Fort Concho safely that autumn, and the soldiers stationed there received their long-overdue payment, unaware for the most part of exactly how close their sustenance had come to disaster, or of the remarkable woman whose lip-reading skill and marksmanship had ensured their payroll's safe arrival. Kessler himself was tried and sentenced to lengthy imprisonment, his gang scattered, and its remaining members either captured or driven from the territory entirely. Wade Calloway received a substantial prison sentence for his corruption and his role in Jane's father's murder, a small measure of justice that, while it could never fully heal the loss Jane had carried for years, at least confirmed publicly and permanently the truth she had always known. Cottonwood Bend prospered in the years that followed, its reputation as a town no longer troubled by outlaw activity drawing new settlers and new commerce to the region. Homer's standing as a ranger grew alongside this prosperity, his methodical, trustworthy approach to law enforcement earning him respect throughout the territory, though he always credited Jane, whenever the story of Devil's Pass came up in conversation, with the true heroism that had saved his life and exposed Calloway's betrayal. Jane's homestead expanded as well, her success with gentling and training horses eventually requiring her to hire additional hands to keep pace with demand, though she never surrendered her own direct involvement in the work she loved, insisting on personally overseeing every horse that passed through her corral. She became something of a local legend among younger women in the surrounding communities, an example held up to demonstrate that a woman's capability need never be limited by whatever challenges circumstance or nature might impose. Their family grew further over the following decade. A third child, another daughter they named Hope, arriving 4 years after Grace, completing a family that Homer often described, in quiet moments of reflection, as more than he had ever believed himself worthy of receiving after the guilt and grief that had defined his life before arriving in Cottonwood Bend. Jane taught all 3 of her children to sign alongside speaking, ensuring that whatever challenges the world might present to any of them, they would carry the same tools of communication and understanding that had shaped her own resilience. Elias grew into a young man with his father's steady strength and his mother's sharp intelligence, eventually following Homer's path into ranger service himself, carrying forward the family's commitment to justice earned through hard-won trust rather than easy assumption. Grace developed her mother's gift with horses, becoming known throughout the region by her early 20s as among the finest trainers in West Texas, while young Hope discovered a talent for teaching, eventually establishing her own school, specifically designed to serve deaf and hard of hearing children throughout the territory, building upon the foundation her mother had first established in that small Cottonwood Bend schoolhouse decades before. Homer Lawson served as a Texas Ranger for another 15 years following his marriage to Jane, eventually retiring to devote himself fully to the Willow Creek homestead that had grown, under both their careful stewardship, into one of the most respected ranching operations in the region. He never forgot the debt he owed to Jane's remarkable skill, the moment on that ridge overlooking Devil's Pass when her precision and courage had saved not only his life, but the mission he had traveled so far to complete. And Jane Langley Lawson, in turn, never forgot the man who had ridden into her valley seeking merely a translator for outlaw signs, and who had instead offered her something she had not realized she still needed after 2 years of solitary grief and stubborn independence. A partner who saw her completely, who trusted her capability without qualification, and who had proven, through every trial they faced together, that love built upon mutual respect and genuine partnership could overcome any obstacle, whether outlaw ambush, corrupt betrayal, or the world's persistent assumptions about what a deaf woman could or could not achieve. They grew old together at Willow Creek, watching their children build lives of their own throughout the territory, watching grandchildren eventually fill the same corral where Jane had once gentled a wild Mustang while a skeptical ranger looked on, unable yet to imagine how thoroughly his life was about to change. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day finally settled into the peaceful rhythm of dusk, they would often sit together on their porch, hands joined, watching the same cottonwood trees that had witnessed their wedding sway gently in the Texas wind, grateful beyond words for the unlikely path that had brought a ranger and a deaf homesteader together, and for the enduring love that had grown from that first desperate need for a translator into a partnership that had, quite simply, saved them both.